Hello and welcome to the shed. In today's video we're going to be talking about wood grain and how that affects the way we do our woodworking. Hope you enjoy. So what is grain? Well, grain is the inherent structure of the tree that gives it its strength to stand up and not fall over. If we break that down a little bit further, we have the width of the tree, or our cross grain, and we have the height of our tree, or the long grain. Now, if we break that down into a plank of timber, we have our small width this way and our long width in the longitudinal of our piece of timber. Now, if we have a look at our cross grain a little further by looking at the end of the grain, we can see that it's a lot of little fairy fibers. Now, to depict that best, my brush is the way to do it. So our end grain is like this. So this is known as our short grain. They're all short little pieces across here, and so if we're cutting across it, we're cutting across a whole bunch. So we'll look at that a little bit further when I talk about sawing, because that affects the type of saws we should use. So we've got a bunch of small tiny fibers. Now in the long grain, like this, we can see this one's been hand planed, so it's smooth. Essentially, if we look at this, we can see the fibers are much longer, and that's why we call them the long grain fibers. Now, generally with your woodworking, if you want ease of use, you're going to be working with the longitudinal part of the timber because that is easier to work with. Yes, we still work with the cross grain, but when it comes to things like hand plating, chiseling, and even sawing, going with that grain is going to be far easier most of the time than going across it, which has its own inherent issues because of a whole bunch of small fibers, and we'll look at that in a moment. One other thing that we need to look at when it comes to the long grain fibers is the orientation of how that piece of timber came out of the tree. Now, generally the grain, because it starts at the bottom and grows up, you're going to be going with the grain if you've got your bottom of your timber moving towards the top. It's not always the case. We have things like branches that affect things, but let's have a look at the grain within this piece of timber that we've got here, and we'll show you how that affects things and why. So when we actually look at the timber, we can see the grain direction if it's a nice clear timber. Some timbers you can't, and that's why I'm using this pine today, so we can actually see the grain direction so you know what you're working with. Most of the time when I'm woodworking and hand planing, for instance, I can determine that it's against the grain by the feel of the hand plane, but let's have a look at the actual timber on here, the actual grain lines, which is lucky that I've got a piece of pine because you have nice lit up growth rings and it allows us to see the grain. So we'll start by looking at this side. So we can see these lines are starting low and coming up this way. So we've got the lines like this. Now, what this means when it comes to hand planing in particular is that if we're coming from this direction over here, we're going to be running into the end grain as it's exposed, whether it's on the top here. In this case, it'll be on the top here. We're going to get exposed to the end grain as it comes to the surface along here. Now, if we look at this piece over here, we can see how that actually works. So, we've hand planed in this way. Our grain is sitting like this. So we haven't come from this end, which would have been with the grain. We've come against the grain and we've hit the end grain, and if we have a close look here, it's torn all these chunks out because what's happened is the hand plane has come through and it's rammed into the blade and it's just torn it out. So that is why generally, for the most part, you want to hand plane with the grain, and why it's good to know the direction of your grain. So you're going to have a far better time hand planing with the grain. It's going to be smooth, and if we had come from this end, we wouldn't have hit any end grain, and it would have been smoothed out and this wouldn't have chonked out. We can see another example on this side. There's the raise of the timber. We can see they're pointing in this direction. So this is the direction. When you're looking at grain direction with something like this, the wider part is always the direction you want to start on if you've got lines like this. We can see on the side here that they're actually pretty straight, but then it's obvious on the face where the direction is. And once again, this one was hand planed in the wrong direction, and it's torn chunks out and it's left the surface all furry. We can see that here as well. The grain direction is coming up this way. Now, if we are planing on this side, the edge instead of the face, so the way it works is, if you're hand planing a face, you want to look at the side of the board to see where the grain's coming from. The side is going to be your best indication, unless you've got something like this pine here, and you can see these rays, and then you can just judge it straight from the surface. Because if we look at the side here, we can't actually really determine where the grain direction is here, because these are all pretty straight through here. You'll often have to look at the face to determine where your grain direction is going on the edge. Now, we can see here that this line runs from all the way back here, and it's running up this way. Comes along here, runs up that way. So, which way is the grain going on this one? You're right, it's going that way. So this is the end we want to hand plane. Things that are very knotty have other issues where you get what's known as reversing grain, and that's where we have other tools that come in, like scrapers, that the grain is not affected by. But we can easily see on this piece of wood here that the grain's coming up and it curves like this, and on this side it's curving and going that way. So we've got the grain on here in two different directions because of the knot. Now, what is a knot? That is where a branch has decided to grow out of the tree, and we can see here that this branch would have been going out in that direction. You can almost make out the shape of it just down in here. And if you see a knot on the surface, it's going to look like this, because obviously the branch is round. And so often, which you can see here, you get the grain doing this, and then I can't quite see it on this, but it's going to curve and sometimes change directions like this, which it sort of is here, and then it's curving back out again. So we can see it makes this rounded force here. So we can see the grain here is going out that way, but up here it's going more that way. Now, we still wouldn't be affected by these bits here if we hand planed in this direction, because it's still going to skip over it, because it's not coming into the sharp edge of it, it's sort of the leeward side, and so the hand planing actually still comes out smooth, like you can see here. However, we can see that that grain is tipping up to the surface here, and we said we were going to be hand planing in this direction. So this grain just up here, in this first little bit up to this knot, could be facing towards the blade and has a potential to tear out. Now, it doesn't, in practice, always cause an issue, and if you have a hand plane with a very tight mouth, it helps to support the fibers as we hand plane, and so you might not get tear out. But as you can see, it's rather important to see the direction of the grain, and more importantly, feel it. When you've done a lot of hand planing, you'll get used to feeling that grain direction, and in my opinion, grain direction is the most important when it comes to hand planing. It's one of the things that is not going to come out the best if you're not paying attention to the grain direction. You will have seen a number of my videos. I go to hand plane something, I'm like, oh, that's against the grain. And I turn it around, it starts going smooth. So it is vital, and you will hear a lot of woodworkers say that, oh, that's against the grain, because they've got used to it. They'll feel the extra resistance when hand planing, and that's generally what you get. A resistance. It's not always going to tear out, or you could go and do a hand planing job like this, run straight into the end grain and tear it out, and then you're like, oh, I've wrecked that piece. So it is something to pay attention to, and grain direction also affects things like wood movement as well. But we'll talk about that in another video when we look at wood movement. Let's just depict this grain a little bit further so you get a better understanding of what I'm talking about and why it tears out before we go and put a hand plane on it and actually see what occurs. So we've got our grain going from low to high here, as we said, so the grain is going in that direction. So if we take our brush, which we were depicting before, and we put it on this angle like this, matching our grain. So if we're hand plane against here, you can see it's going to dig straight into those short fibers, lift them, and that's why we end up with tear out. Now, if we were coming from this direction, you could see we'll come straight in, it'll just brush straight over the top of them, knock them down, and it's not going to lift the grain. And so that's really the fundamental reason why, with hand planing in particular, that going with the grain is definitely what you want to do to prevent tear out. Now, when we do have reversing grain and things, it is a little more complicated to deal with. Sometimes you might have to hand plane from both directions. Sometimes you might have to hand plane it and then come back and use a scraper of some sort, which it doesn't really get affected by the grain like a blade does. So let's have it over here. We'll grab a plane and let's do a couple of hand planings, knowing which way our direction of this grain is going. So first we're going to start hand planing just through this section here. We can see the grains coming up, so what's going to happen? Okay, we've taken a clean shaving. It's a little bit wavy, there's not so many problems. We're on a fairly fine shaving here, so we're actually okay even though the grain is rising up here. So what happens, and where you have the most effective against the grain, is when you try to do a thicker shaving, but as I've said, it doesn't always depict. So what happens is this. So we've taken a heavier shaving, and I don't know if you can see that, but it's taken some little tiny chunks out of it here because we're against the grain with a slightly thicker shaving. You can sometimes get away with it with a very fine shaving, and that is another way to deal with reversing grain. Very tight, very fine shavings. But I don't know if you can see that it has taken some little bits out of the surface as we hand plane. So now, let's go with the grain. We'll stick with our nice thick shaving. Let's see what happens. You can also hear the sound in the shaving is different. So that has actually smoothed it out. We'll do this just so you can hear the sound difference. You can hear it sort of catching. It doesn't make that sort of squeal. So if we go with the grain, you can hear that sound. It doesn't do that a lot of the time with a thick shaving. Sometimes with your thinner shavings, if you're going against the grain, because it's got a lot more resistance against it. So you push the hand plane through and it sort of catches all the way along and stops it. If you're going with the grain like this, hand planed, thick shaving, that is smooth and polished all across that surface now because we're gone with the grain. It's taken out those little bits of tear out, and that is with quite a thick shaving. As we can see here, that's a chunky shaving. It's not small, it's not see-through, it's quite a thick one. So that is the best way to depict the difference in your hand planing when you go like that with the grain or against the grain. We can run into a lot of issues hand planing around a knot like this. So we can see here with this knot, our grain is still going that way, so we're going to hand plane from this side. Let's go with the grain, and let's see if we do get a little bit of tear out by doing that. So we can already hear we're not getting that squeal off it, which means we are hitting some sort of a resistance. In this case, we actually have a double knot. There's a knot here and a knot here. Now I can feel where the knot is here. That is rough. The grain's coming in two different directions in here. Got a rough spot here. It is relatively smooth in between those areas because the grain, we can see over this side, is rising up, but we have still got a little bit of roughness that you can actually see just through here and through here. You can see the little bit of tear out here, a little bit of tear out here, because the grain is altering its direction slightly. And that's why you tend to have quite a few issues when you're hand planing around knots. So to prevent tear out, a very close chip breaker can help to prevent that. It curls the chip out a little bit sooner, and what that does is it tries to prevent you ramming straight in under end grain, and because it lifts it, it breaks the fibers ahead just on top of the blade as you run through, and it can knock it out. The other thing is a tight mouth. So the low angle planes are good for this and easier to pick this, because you can adjust these toe plates here and make a very, very tight gap, which means you can take that very fine shaving and actually go against the grain, so you can actually still do your finishing planing over the top of something like that, because it's got a lot more weight. There's a less gap between the fiber, so it actually holds the fiber down. So as you're taking your shaving, it holds the front of it down as you come through, and that's trying to stop it from lifting. Because if the blade comes in, because it's a wedge, and it comes straight in like we showed here, and it lifts it, you're going to tear it out. Now, if we've got a tight mouth just ahead of the blade, we might be able to go in like this and actually take a thin piece like that off the top, which is our shaving, and it's not going to jam straight in and go on a deep angle and then try and rip it up a lot heavier. So that is what a tight mouth does. A chip breaker curls the shaving sooner, and that can help to prevent that. And that's why the bevel down planes have that. They can have very tight mouths if you adjust the frog. But for active adjustment on the fly, an adjustable toe plate on these is easier. The frogs are a little more annoying to do that with, unless you've got a bedrock, which you could actually just undo from the back and slide it forward if you wanted to adjust it, which I don't tend to adjust them. I tend to have a relatively tight mouth on most of my hand planes and not adjust them. And if I do have some really figured timber that is causing me issues, I use my low angle so I can adjust it and get that very tight mouth. So let's go back over there. We'll hand plane in that same direction and see if we can eliminate, or mostly eliminate, that tear out. We can already hear with this, we're getting that whistle that we got when we went with the grain. So now let's have a look. So after doing a few, we've still got a little tiny bit of tear out here. We haven't really got any tear out here that we had before, and we've still got a tiny bit here, but it's not as much. It's only in this isolated area and this little isolated area here, and you could hear the difference. There was definitely less resistance on that hand plane because of the tight mouth, and the fibers just got taken off easier because they were under pressure, under compression, and not just freely lifting because they weren't under enough compression. To show that a little bit more, let's widen this mouth. We'll make it nice, wide and open, and see what happens. There we go, it's open as wide as it can go now. Let's see the difference. We're still getting a little bit of that sound as we did before, but it is got a little more tear out. We can see the tear out is quite obvious here, and so that's why a tight mouth makes a big difference in timbers where you've got a lot of reversing grain. You can clearly see here that the difference in the effect versus the tight mouth. Hopefully now you have a better understanding why grain direction is so important when hand planing, but grain direction also forms a role when it comes to sawing and chiseling. When we chisel, we're essentially got the same effect as a hand plane because we've got a chisel, a wedge shape. It can go in, it can wedge things apart. So working with the grain is always going to be easier with chisels than going against the grain sometimes. If you're carving, sometimes across the grain is better because you've got a short grain. But let's have a look how the grain affects saws, and you might use 2 different types of saws, and that's the reason there's 2 different types of saws, is because there's 2 different types of grain. So let's jump back over to the vise and we'll talk about hand sawing and how the grain direction or the grain type affects that as well. So our long grain, because it's short fibers, we use what's called a rip saw. So that is a series of chisel teeth like this, lined up. So if I grab a couple, they're lined up like this, and they're designed to tear out a very small bit of timber. So generally we're going down the long grain, so we're going between the fibers in the cross section. So because of that, we can actually saw through like this, and we'll just knock out small pieces like this. So we're just removing a small amount all the way through, and that's why a rip works best in that situation. So we want to saw down this way, we'll use a rip saw, which has 90-degree teeth. We can see here, they're very square on the front, and it's a series of chisels. Hopefully you can see that up close, and they are square across. Now, when it comes to sawing across, if we saw across with a rip saw, it's going to come in, and if we depict that with these chisels, because I don't want to damage my brush, so we're coming in with that square edge, we're going to hit against it, and we're going to form a lot of resistance as we come across. Now, that effect is less the more teeth you have on your saw, but it is still a contributing factor. So we can see that it's going to catch everything, but this way it just goes straight through it. So when we come to go across the grain, we need to sever those fibers. And so what do we use? We use what's known as a crosscut saw. The crosscut saw comes to a point on the top, and we have alternating, they're not square across, one's pointed the other way, and so we've got knives on the saw all the way across. Why is that? Well, we grab our marking knife, we can actually just score across them, so we're going to cut them easier. So we get to a very fine point, send that point across, it severs them, you keep going, it severs them, and so it's going to take all these little fibers. Because if you try and use a knife this way, you can see it's going to be less effective. We're going to end up with a very tight thing, but it's just going to go in between them, and it's not going to be as effective, and it's going to be very slow to remove that material because it's a very, very fine point at the tip of these as they run through. So let's do this in practice. So this is my rip saw. We're going to go down the grain. So that was 10 passes. You can see how far down we got. We've got a nice sharp saw, and you can see that we've gone with the grain because it's left this little thing where it's just pushed the fibers out of the way. Let's try and do that with the crosscut saw. So that took roughly 21 to get down. Now this is a little more aggressive saw. It's a longer saw, so you would think less strokes, but you can see using a crosscut on here took longer. It's much slower because it's using a little knife to try and remove the material, which it can do, but it's removing such a small amount each time. It's just less effective. So now I wanted to have a look at how they compare going across the grain. Let's start with the crosscut saw. So that's 10. We can see that it has tried to sever the fibers on this side. Sometimes the fibers still don't sever properly on pine, and so that is something you got to watch out for, and especially if you're hand planing plywood, you'll get this sort of tear out because of the different grains. So that was 10 strokes. Let's go with the rip cut and see what the difference is. So in this case, we did sort of go a similar distance to the crosscut, but we can see here how all the little fibers have lifted. It's not severed them, it's just ripped them out, and we can see a big difference as to how clean it is using a cross cut versus a rip cut. Now, generally, you're not going to get the cleanest of cuts using a panel saw. The teeth are just too big, and that's why we have still got a little bit of tear out here, because we've got quite an aggressive saw there versus... So this one is at about 13 teeth per inch, I think it was. This one's at 8. So there's a big difference in the amount of teeth, and as I said, with the rip cut, you can get cleaner cuts if you get smaller teeth, and so obviously in this case it's not the case, but had we used a cross-cut saw that had that same amount of teeth, it would have been even cleaner than what we see here. You can see the difference. The kerf is much larger because it's a larger saw. Kerf's much finer because it's what's called a joinery or tenon saw. But we can clearly see the night and day difference between the cross-cut going across the grain versus the rip cut. And even up here, we can see the difference. Although we used a more aggressive cross-cut saw, it still took way more strokes to get the same depth as it did with our rip cut saw. So that is how grain direction affects really the two major things that you do when it comes to woodworking. You got your cross grain and your long grain, and you can see how that grain affects your hand planing and your sawing. There are other things that it can affect, but these are the major ones that I wanted to talk about, and I think it's a fundamental thing that you need to understand if you're going to do primarily hand tool woodworking. However, if you're putting these timbers through electrical planers and stuff, you can see that's why this is all rough to the surface. It's been put through a skip planing machine, and all it's done is just made it relatively flat, but we can see it is very rough to the surface, this, and so you do still end up with these tear out issues using machines. So there you have it, folks. I hope that gives you some idea as to why it's important to learn about grain direction and to look at it and listen out for it, especially when hand planing, and how it affects the types of saws you use, the types of hand planes you use, and the directions and how careful you have to be with various joinery techniques and that you're actually doing on your timber. So if you like this video, please do like and subscribe down below. While you're down there, do sound off in the comments. If I missed anything in this video, do leave it down below. I tried to cover everything that I could think of, but maybe I missed something by accident. So if you can think of something that maybe I didn't cover that I should have, do leave it down below, and maybe we can make a follow-up video if necessary. And if you'd like to see another great video such as the one you've seen here today, do check out the videos on screen now. Bye for now.